They said I was nothing, just a girl, a burden, unworthy of love or education. My own father turned his back on me, choosing his new family over his own blood. Beaten, abandoned, and left to struggle on the streets, I had no choice but to fight for my survival. But what they never expected was that I would rise, that one day I would return, not as the helpless girl they threw away, but as the woman who owned everything they had lost. This is my story. The sound of heavy footsteps filled the small, dimly lit house. I froze, my little fingers tightening around the old ragged doll in my lap. My heart pounded, and I held my breath. I knew what was coming. "Where is she?" My father's deep, angry voice echoed through the house. I wanted to disappear. I wanted to run, but there was nowhere to hide. The door to my tiny room burst open, and there he stood, my father, his face twisted with anger. He was tall, his shadow stretching across the room like a monster. "You're sitting here again, playing with this nonsense," he bellowed. Before I could respond, he snatched the doll from my hands and threw it across the room. It landed near the broken window, covered in dust and dirt. Tears welled up in my eyes, but I knew better than to cry. Crying only made it worse. Girls don't need toys. Girls don't need dreams. You are nothing. Do you hear me? I nodded quickly, keeping my eyes on the floor. You will never go to school. You will never be anything. You will stay here and do as I say. I bit my lip, my tiny hands trembling. I wanted to scream, to tell him he was wrong, that I wanted to learn to be something. But I didn't dare. My stepmother stood in the doorway, arms crossed, a smirk on her face. She never said much when my father yelled at me, but her silence spoke louder than words. She didn't care. She never did. Her son, my half-brother, sat in the living room playing with expensive toys my father had bought him. I watched him through the doorway, wondering why he was treated like a prince while I was treated like a burden. My mother had passed away when I was just 6 years old. She was the only one who ever loved me. I remembered the warmth of her embrace, the way she would stroke my hair and whisper, "You are special, my love. One day you will shine." But she was gone, and with her, my happiness had vanished too. After she died, my father remarried. At first, I had hoped for kindness from my new stepmother, but I quickly realized that she only saw me as a nuisance. She made it clear that my only purpose was to serve. "Go fetch water," she would order, even when I was sick. "Clean the floors. Wash the dishes." No matter how hard I worked, it was never enough. But the worst part wasn't the work. It was the beatings. Whenever I made the slightest mistake, spilled water, forgot to sweep a corner of the room, or didn't respond quickly enough, my father would strike me. Some nights, I lay on the thin mat in my tiny room, staring at the ceiling, wondering why I was born. One evening, after a particularly harsh beating, I sat outside under the old mango tree, staring at the stars. My back ached, and my lip was bleeding, but I didn't care. I whispered into the night, "Is there a reason for my life? Or am I just a mistake?" The stars didn't answer. The next morning, as I fetched water from the well, I overheard my father talking to a neighbor. "I won't waste my money sending a girl to school," he said with a laugh. "She will only get married and become someone's servant. What's the point?" My hands clenched into fists around the heavy bucket. I wanted to scream, to tell him that I was more than just a girl. I wanted to learn. I wanted to be someone. But I knew my words wouldn't change anything. So I swallowed my anger and carried the heavy bucket back to the house, my shoulders aching. Life continued this way for years. Beatings, chores, insults. By the time I was 17, I had grown tired of the pain, the suffering, the feeling of worthlessness. One night, as I lay on my mat, staring at the ceiling like I had done countless times before, something inside me snapped. "I can't do this anymore," I whispered. I sat up, my heart pounding. For the first time in my life, I made a decision for myself. I was going to leave. I didn't know where I would go. I had no money, no friends, no family who cared. But I had to try. I waited until the house was silent. The only sounds were the distant hoots of an owl and the soft snoring of my father and stepmother. Slowly, I got up and packed a small bag. I didn't have much, just an old dress, a pair of worn-out sandals, and a few pieces of bread I had saved from dinner. Before stepping out of the house, I took one last look around. This place had never been my home. Taking a deep breath, I stepped outside. The night air was cold, and the darkness felt overwhelming. But for the first time in my life, I felt something else. Hope. And with that hope, I walked away, leaving behind the pain, the rejection, and the house that had never been a home. I didn't know where I was going. I didn't know what would happen next. But I was ready to find out. The night was cold, and the streets were lonelier than I had imagined. The moment I stepped away from my father's house, fear crept in like a shadow. I had never been outside this late, and now, I had no home to return to. I wrapped my arms around myself, trying to keep warm. My small bag hung over my shoulder, carrying the only belongings I had in the world. My stomach growled, reminding me that I hadn't eaten much that day. I kept walking. I didn't know where I was going. All I knew was that I couldn't stop. I had spent 17 years feeling trapped, beaten and unloved. There was no way I was going back. But where could I go? The streets were dark, and most houses had their lights off. I passed by shops that had closed for the night, their shutters locked. The only sounds were the distant barking of stray dogs, and the occasional rumbling of an old truck driving past. For a moment I hesitated. Had I made a mistake? Was it too late to turn back? No. I shook my head. Going back meant returning to pain. It meant never having a chance at freedom. I had to keep going. After what felt like hours of walking, I finally saw a dimly lit park. It was empty except for an old wooden bench near a large tree. My feet were aching, and my body was exhausted. I slowly walked over to the bench and sat down. I exhaled deeply, my breath visible in the cold night air. For the first time, I was truly alone. I hugged my bag and leaned back, staring at the sky. The stars twinkled above, bright and distant. "I'm really out here," I whispered. A part of me was scared, the other part relieved. No one would hit me here. No one would insult me. But then another painful thought came. No one would take care of me either. I was on my own. I closed my eyes, trying to push away my worries. I needed to rest. But sleep didn't come easily. Every small noise made me jump. The rustling of leaves, the chirping of crickets, a stray dog sniffing nearby. At some point, exhaustion took over, and I drifted off into a light, uneasy sleep. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of birds chirping and the warm sun on my face. For a moment, I forgot where I was. But then the reality hit me. I was homeless. I sat up, stretching my stiff limbs. My stomach growled louder this time, reminding me that I hadn't eaten. I opened my bag and pulled out a small piece of bread. It was dry and hard, but I ate it slowly, savoring every bite. I didn't know when I would eat again. As I chewed, I watched people passing by the park. Women carrying baskets, men riding bicycles, children laughing and running around. I envied them. I wanted to be like them, to have a normal life, to have a family that cared, to not worry about where my next meal would come from. But that wasn't my reality. I needed to figure out my next move. I couldn't just sit on a bench forever. After finishing my bread, I grabbed my bag and stood up. My legs felt weak, but I forced myself to keep walking. I needed to find a way to survive. As I walked through the town, I noticed a small market where people were selling fruits, vegetables, and other goods. The smell of food filled the air, making my stomach ache even more. I watched as a woman placed fresh loaves of bread on a wooden table. My mouth watered. I wanted to ask for just one piece, but I knew better. People didn't give things for free. Instead, I stood nearby observing. I noticed how the workers carried baskets, cleaned tables, and helped customers. Maybe I could do that too. Taking a deep breath, I approached the woman selling bread. "Excuse me," I said hesitantly. She turned to me, raising an eyebrow. "Yes." I swallowed hard. "Do you need any help? I can clean or carry things. Anything." She studied me for a moment, then sighed. "Do you have experience?" I shook my head. "No, but I learn fast." She hesitated, then pointed to a broom leaning against a wooden stall. "Sweep the front of my shop. If you do a good job, I might give you something." My heart lifted. "Thank you." I grabbed the broom and started sweeping. I worked as hard as I could, making sure every corner was clean. I didn't care that my hands were getting sore. I didn't care that I was sweating. I just wanted a chance. When I finished, I stepped back, breathing heavily. I'm done. The woman looked around and nodded. Not bad. She reached into a basket and handed me a small loaf of bread. Tears pricked my eyes as I took it. Thank you, I whispered. She gave me a small smile. Come back tomorrow. Maybe I'll have more work for you. I nodded eagerly. I will. I walked away, clutching the bread like it was the most valuable thing in the world. For the first time, I had earned something on my own. And for the first time, I felt hope. The bread in my hand felt like gold. I clutched it tightly, my heart swelling with gratitude. It was just a small loaf, but it meant everything to me. I had earned it. I had survived one night on my own, and now, for the first time, I had a chance to make it. But I knew that one loaf wouldn't be enough. I needed more. As I walked through the town, I saw people going about their daily lives. Mothers carrying babies, children laughing, men sitting in front of shops talking. None of them knew what I was going through. None of them knew that a 17-year-old girl, abandoned by her own family, was fighting to survive. I found a small alleyway near the market and sat down. My feet ached from all the walking, and my body was still sore from the beatings I had endured at home. I took a deep breath and looked at the bread in my hand. I wanted to eat it all in one bite, but I forced myself to take small pieces. I had to make it last. As I ate, I thought about my father, my stepmother, my half-brother. Were they even wondering where I was? Did they care? I doubted it. My father had always told me I was worthless, that I would never amount to anything, that I wasn't worth spending money on because I was just a girl who wasn't worth educating, a girl who was only good for housework and obeying orders. I clenched my fists, my heart burning with anger. I would prove him wrong. I would become something. I didn't know how, but I would find a way. The next morning, I woke up early and went back to the market. The woman who had given me bread the day before was already setting up her stall. I hesitated for a moment, then walked up to her. She looked up and nodded. You're back. I told you I would be, I said. She handed me the broom again. Clean up, and I'll see what I can give you. I didn't hesitate. I grabbed the broom and got to work. For the next few weeks, this became my routine. Every morning, I showed up at the market, ready to work. I swept the floors, cleaned the tables, and sometimes even helped carry baskets for customers. In return, I got food. Sometimes bread, sometimes fruit, sometimes a small bowl of soup. It wasn't much, but it kept me alive. I slept wherever I could, sometimes on a park bench, sometimes in an abandoned building. I learned to avoid the dangerous parts of town. I learned which streets were safe and which ones weren't. I learned how to survive. But I also learned something else. The world was cruel, especially to a girl alone. One evening, after a long day at the market, I was walking through a quiet street when I heard footsteps behind me. I turned around and saw a group of 3 men following me. My heart pounded. I quickened my pace. So did they. Fear gripped my chest. I knew what could happen to a girl alone at night. I had to get away. I turned a corner and ran as fast as I could. My breath came in short gasps, my feet barely touching the ground. I didn't stop until I saw a crowded area up ahead. A small shop with people gathered outside. I ran inside, my chest heaving. An older man behind the counter looked up in surprise. What's wrong? I turned around. The men were gone. I swallowed hard, trying to catch my breath. I just needed to get inside. The man studied me for a moment. Then he nodded. You're alone, aren't you? I hesitated, then nodded. He sighed. I've seen many like you. Girls who run away. Girls with nowhere to go. I lowered my gaze. I hated that he was right. Are you hungry? He asked. I nodded slowly. He walked to the back and returned with a small plate of rice. I stared at it, my stomach growling. I don't have any money. He shook his head. Eat. Tears filled my eyes as I picked up the spoon. Thank you. As I ate, the man sat across from me. What's your name? I hesitated. Eliana. He nodded. I'm Mr. Thomas. You remind me of my daughter. His voice grew quiet. She left home too. I don't know where she is now. I paused. I'm sorry. He gave a small smile. The world is hard for people like us, Eliana. But you have to be strong. I swallowed hard. I don't know how. You will. He leaned forward. You have fire in you. I can see it. I stared at him, wondering if he was just being kind or if he truly believed that. Either way, his words stayed with me. That night, he let me sleep in the back of his shop. It was the first time in weeks that I had slept without fear. But I knew this wasn't a permanent solution. I couldn't live on kindness forever. I needed more. I needed a real chance. And somehow, I was going to find it. The morning sun streamed through the small shop window, warming my face as I slowly opened my eyes. For a moment, I forgot where I was. Then reality hit me. I was still homeless, still struggling. But for the first time in a long while, I had slept peacefully. I stretched my sore limbs and sat up, looking around the storage room where Mr. Thomas had let me stay for the night. There were shelves stacked with bags of rice, flour, and canned food. The air smelled of spices and something warm. Fresh bread? As if on cue, my stomach growled. I stepped out of the storage room and saw Mr. Thomas at the counter, arranging some goods. When he noticed me, he smiled. "Good morning, Ileana. Sleep well?" I nodded. "Yes. Thank you for letting me stay." He gestured toward the small wooden table near the counter. "Come, eat something before you go." I hesitated. I had already taken too much from him. "I don't want to be a burden." He chuckled. "Nonsense. Just eat." I sat down as he placed a plate in front of me. Steaming porridge with honey drizzled on top. I took a spoonful, letting the warmth spread through my body. "Do you have any plans for today?" he asked. I shook my head. "I'll go back to the market. Try to find more work." Mr. Thomas leaned against the counter, watching me. "What if I offered you a job?" I stopped eating and looked up at him, my heart racing. "A job?" He nodded. "You're a hard worker. I could use someone to help around the shop. Sweeping, stocking shelves, handling customers. It wouldn't pay much, but you'd have a place to sleep and food to eat." I stared at him in disbelief. "You'd really do that for me?" He smiled warmly. "Everyone deserves a chance, Ileana." Tears burned the back of my eyes. I had been fighting so hard to survive, struggling to find a place where I belonged. And now, someone was finally giving me an opportunity. "I'd love to work here," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Good," Mr. Thomas said. "You can start today." I nodded eagerly. "Thank you. I promise I won't let you down." Working at Mr. Thomas's shop was harder than I expected, but I loved it. I woke up early every morning to clean the floors, arrange the shelves, and assist customers. Mr. Thomas taught me how to manage money, how to talk to people, and even how to read and write better. For the first time, I wasn't just surviving, I was learning. The market vendors who once saw me as just a homeless girl now greeted me with respect. I was no longer an outsider. I was part of something, but I didn't forget where I had come from. I still remembered my father's cruel words. "You are just a girl. You will never amount to anything." I was determined to prove him wrong. Every day after work, I saved a small portion of my earnings. It wasn't much, but I refused to spend it unless necessary. I had a goal. I wanted more than just survival. I wanted a future. One evening, as I was closing up the shop, Mr. Thomas called me over. "You've been here for a while now, Ileana," he said. "What do you want to do with your life?" I hesitated. No one had ever asked me that before. I want to do something great," I admitted. "I don't want to just work in a shop forever. I want to own something, build something." Mr. Thomas smiled. "Then you need to learn more. Education is power, Ileana. If you want a future, you have to fight for it." His words struck something deep inside me. I had never been allowed to go to school, but now, maybe I could learn on my own. Maybe I could create my own future. And I would, no matter what it took. Every night after closing the shop, I sat in the back room with a candle and a notebook, practicing the words Mr. Thomas taught me during the day. At first, it was hard. I struggled to read simple sentences, and my handwriting was shaky, but I refused to give up. "You're learning fast," Mr. Thomas said one evening as he watched me copy words from an old newspaper. I smiled, feeling a sense of pride I had never felt before. "I just want to catch up. I lost so much time." He nodded. "And you're making up for it. Keep going." His encouragement fueled me. During the day, I worked in the shop. At night, I studied. The more I learned, the more confident I became. I started handling more responsibilities, counting money, keeping records, and even negotiating prices with suppliers. Mr. Thomas trusted me, and that trust made me want to push myself harder. But not everyone was happy about my progress. One afternoon, as I was arranging some items on the shelves, a woman walked into the shop. She was in her late 30s, dressed in fine clothes, with gold jewelry that gleamed in the sunlight. I recognized her instantly. My stepmother. My heart stopped. She hadn't seen me yet, so I quickly turned my back, pretending to be busy. But it was too late. Eliana. Her sharp voice cut through the air like a knife. I took a deep breath and turned around, meeting her cold, disbelieving stare. "What are you doing here?" she demanded, her eyes narrowing. "I work here," I said simply, keeping my voice steady. She scoffed. "So you're a shop girl now?" "I'm not surprised. After all, what else could you become?" Her words stung, but I refused to let her see my pain. "I'm learning," I said, "and I'm doing just fine without you." Her lips curled into a cruel smile. "Your father will be interested to know where you've been. Maybe I should tell him." I clenched my fists. "I don't care what you tell him. I'm never coming back." She stared at me for a long moment, then laughed. "You think you're strong now, don't you? Just because some old man gave you a job? You'll never be anything more than a street girl, Eliana. You'll always be beneath us." I felt my chest tighten with anger, but I refused to let her win. "I'd rather be a street girl with dignity than live in that house as a slave," I shot back. Her face darkened. She opened her mouth to say something else, but Mr. Thomas appeared behind me. "Can I help you, ma'am?" His voice was calm but firm. My stepmother glanced at him, then at me. She let out a small huff. "No, I was just leaving." With that, she turned on her heel and stormed out of the shop. As soon as she was gone, my knees felt weak. Mr. Thomas placed a hand on my shoulder. "You okay?" I nodded slowly, though my heart was still racing. "She thinks I'll never be anything." He smiled. "Then prove her wrong." From that day forward, I worked harder than ever. I saved every coin I earned, determined to build something for myself. Months passed, then years. By the time I turned 20, I had learned enough about business to run a shop on my own. One evening, Mr. Thomas sat me down with a serious expression. "You've been with me for a long time, Eliana, and you've worked harder than anyone I've ever met." I swallowed nervously. "Is something wrong?" He chuckled. "Not at all. In fact, I have something for you." He reached into his pocket and handed me a set of keys. I stared at them in confusion. "What's this?" He smiled. "The deed to the shop." My breath caught in my throat. "What?" "I'm getting old, Eliana," he said, "and I've been looking for someone to take over. Someone who deserves it." Tears welled up in my eyes. "But I don't have the money to buy it from you." "You don't need to," he said. "You've already earned it." I couldn't believe it. The girl who once had nothing, who had been beaten, abandoned, and told she was worthless, was now the owner of a business. I hugged Mr. Thomas tightly, sobbing into his shoulder. "Thank you for everything." He patted my back. "You did this, Eliana. You built this life. Now go and make something great out of it." I wiped my tears and nodded. "I will." And I meant it. Owning the shop felt surreal. For years, I had worked under Mr. Thomas, learning, growing, and dreaming of a better life. And now, the place that once gave me shelter and hope belonged to me. But I wasn't satisfied. I wanted more. I wanted to build something bigger, something that would change my life forever. So I started expanding, from one shop to many. With the little money I had saved over the years, I made changes to the shop. I repainted the walls, added more shelves, and expanded the products we sold. I introduced new items, fresh produce, household goods, and even handmade crafts from local vendors. Word spread quickly. People began coming from different parts of town just to buy from my shop. They said it was different, that it felt welcoming and fair. I hired 2 assistants to help with the growing number of customers. Business was booming, and for the first time in my life, I had financial freedom. But I didn't stop there. With my profits, I rented another shop space across town and opened a second store, then a third. By the time I turned 25, I was a successful businesswoman, running multiple stores across the city. I had everything I had ever dreamed of, but deep inside, there was still a wound that hadn't healed. I had never seen my father again, not since the day I left home, but fate had other plans. One afternoon, as I sat in my office reviewing my business accounts, I received an unexpected call from a real estate agent. "Miss Eliana, I have a property you might be interested in," he said. I frowned. "I'm not looking for a new shop space right now." "You might want to see this one," he insisted. "It's a house." I almost refused until he mentioned the address. It was my father's house. My hands trembled. "Why is it for sale?" "The owner has defaulted on his mortgage. The bank is auctioning it off," the agent explained. I didn't hesitate. "I'll buy it." The day I finalized the purchase, I stood in front of the house that once held all my pain. Memories came flooding back. The nights I cried myself to sleep, the bruises, the harsh words. But I wasn't that helpless girl anymore. I was a woman with power. And now, I owned the very place where my suffering began. As I entered the house, I found my father and stepmother sitting in the living room, their faces pale with shock. "You," my father whispered. My stepmother's eyes widened. "What are you doing here?" I held up the ownership papers. "I own this house now." They looked at each other in horror. "That's impossible," my stepmother spat. I smiled coldly. "Nothing is impossible. You threw me away like I was worthless. But I survived. And now, I'm the one in charge." My father's face was filled with disbelief. "Eliana, please, we have nowhere else to go." For years, I had imagined this moment. I had dreamed of the day he would beg me for help. And now here it was. But instead of feeling satisfaction, all I felt was emptiness. I had won. But was revenge really what I wanted? I took a deep breath, staring at the man who had never shown me love. "I needed you when I was a child," I said, my voice calm but firm. "And you turned your back on me. Now I'm returning the favor." I turned to leave, ignoring his desperate pleas. This was my closure. I had finally freed myself from my past. And now my future was mine to create.